Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Jaros, and today we are going to talk about Hofstede's cultural dimensions of communication. These were developed by Geert Hofstede, who was a Dutch social psychologist. And what he did was provide over 116,000 questionnaires in companies in 40 countries around the world. And these dimensions allowed business leaders and communicators and world leaders to better understand how different cultures perceive different situations. Let's take a look at what those 6 dimensions are. The high power distance versus low power distance, high uncertainty avoidance versus low uncertainty avoidance, collectivism versus individualism, masculinity versus femininity, high context versus low context, and then polychronic versus monochronic. Let's go ahead and break down each of these different dimensions one at a time. Let's get started. The first dimension we will talk about is the power distant concept. Simply, power distance is the amount of authority that is given to the top or the boss versus the subordinates. So in high power distant cultures, that high power distance means there's a bigger gap between the boss and the subordinate. Whereas in low power distant cultures, that gap is less, that there's more of an even distribution of authority or decision making. Think of nations like the Philippines, Venezuela, or Mexico as high power distant cultures that tend to be more autocratic or authoritarian in their culture's approach. Whereas low power distant cultures tend to be New Zealand, Denmark, or the United States of America. Think about the healthcare profession for a moment as a great example of the differences between these two cultures. In high power distant cultures, there tend to be more doctors than there are nurses. Whereas in low power distant cultures, there tend to be more nurses than there are doctors. That's because in high power distant cultures, that title demands respect. And the people want that title, that doctor, to be doing the procedure. And so there are more doctors doing the majority of the work, and there's less delegation to nurses. Whereas in low power distant cultures, it's very common that you might have a nurse or a practitioner do a simplistic or a mundane procedure, whereas the doctor comes in and gives their opinion, gives their insight, or prioritizes more dangerous, life-threatening, or serious procedures. Just as an example of how the power tends to be more spread out in low-power distant cultures and more consolidated with high-power cultures. The last example I want to share of a high-power distant culture to an extreme was Korean Airlines back in the 1990s. This airline had significantly more crashes per liftoff than other airlines like United Airlines or other worldly airline organizations. When they were investigating why there were so many incidents of crashes or malfunctions, what they discovered was that the first officer or the second in command on the plane would never speak up if they saw something wrong. When they questioned why this was happening, one first officer said, "The captain's in charge. What the captain says goes. To question the captain's decision-making is disrespectful, so we say nothing." What Korean Airlines had to realize is that when their subordinate or the second in command was not speaking up, they were not catching a problem which were causing crashes or malfunctions. Thus, Korean Airlines had to restructure their culture, their corporate culture, into having a more safer delivery of their services. There we have the cultural dimension of power distance. The next dimension we are going to talk about is the uncertainty avoidance concept. Very simply, the uncertainty avoidance is the amount of threat a culture feels when presented with uncertainty or ambiguous situations. The high uncertainty avoidance cultures are like Greece, Arab nations, Germany, or Japan. And with these cultures, they tend to follow more rules. Strict, more formal, because what they don't want is confusion, ambiguity. The more process, the more procedures that are in place, the more certainty you have. and the less likelihood of a mistake taking place. Whereas low uncertainty avoidant nations or cultures are like Sweden, Denmark, or the United States of America that tend to be more open to change, going with the flow, and seeing what happens. You can see where many managers might be confused with each other, where high uncertainty avoidant cultures think that low uncertainty avoidant cultures tend to be careless or making a lot of mistakes. They lack preciseness. Whereas the low uncertainty avoidant nations feel like there's too much rigidness, too much structure, and the inability to be flexible or innovative because of so many procedures. Back in World War II, there was a German officer who made this comment about Americans during World War II. He said, "The reason why Americans are so good at war is because war is chaos, and Americans practice chaos on a regular basis." So we see the German mentality, the high uncertainty avoidant culture, being very precise, very exact in their war procedures. Whereas Americans tended to be more sporadic, more impromptu, more, as he put it, chaotic in their style to war. Thus, we conclude the uncertainty avoidance dimension. The next dimension is collectivism versus individualism. Very simply, individualistic cultures is typically when the individual makes the decision based on their own best interest, or the best interest of those close to them. Whereas collective cultures tend to be more about the group makes the decision for what's best for the many, what's best for the group. We see examples of collective cultures like Nigeria, Guatemala, Japan. Interestingly enough, in China, there is not a word for individualism. In China, the closest thing in their language to individualism is selfishness. Just in the way of just their culture and the language and how collective their thought process is. When we look at individualistic cultures, we look at Australia, Great Britain, or even the United States of America. That tends to be more about the self or someone's autonomy. In business, we see the same kind of decision-making take place. Individualistic cultures tend to have the individualistic approach that I'm the CEO, I'm the boss, I'm the manager, it is my job to make the decision, and therefore I make that decision. But individualistic cultures negotiating with collective cultures may realize there's a gap in their communication, where individualistic cultures want a decision right away, quickly, more spontaneous. Collective cultures take more time to think about a specific path to go on. The collective culture in negotiation doesn't have one person making that decision. The negotiator will hear the ideas, hear the thought, write it down, and go back to their team and ask each team member their opinion on why they should do this business deal or not. Therefore, they rely on the expertise of everybody in the room collectively before moving forward. Then when they make a decision, it's not one person, it's the group. So notice the pros and cons with collective cultures or individual cultures. Collective cultures tend to move slower because they require input from everyone. When you get input from everyone, you get everybody's expertise, everybody's knowledge. It's not just me, Nathan, making the decision. It's all of us making the decision for each other. Whereas individualistic cultures tend to be very quick, fast-paced, because you only need one person's approval, but may lack the expertise if not sought out. That's just an example of collective cultures versus individualistic cultures and the way people tend to make decisions about situations or ideas or making a solution on a problem. The next dimension is on masculinity versus femininity. Now, this is not about men or versus women, but rather the perception of what is masculine and feminine in Hofstede's eyes. And when we look at a masculine culture by Hofstede, was a culture that was more about assertiveness and more about the status or the acquisition of money or wealth, the acquisition of things. Whereas feminine cultures placed more of an emphasis on compassion, quality of life, and family life. We see masculine cultures like Venezuela, Mexico, or Japan. And we see feminine cultures like Sweden, Denmark, or Norway. In the famous movie A Christmas Carol, we can see the Ebenezer Scrooge, the old man who only cared about wealth and his business, torturing Bob Cratchit, who all he wanted to do was go back to his family to celebrate Christmas Eve and Christmas together. That was an example of a masculine culture. Your work is your priority, your family comes second. Whereas we look at a company in Finland, where it is not uncommon for an employee, even a male employee, to leave a meeting to go take care of their children. We look at the two different sides of more focused on wealth or focus on family life. So imagine the kind of culture gap when working with different cultures of masculine versus feminine. If someone is more focused on wealth and status and assertiveness, they're not going to truly understand the need for family life, family time, time off, because that's not important to them. That doesn't help you acquire more status. Whereas feminine cultures looks at the masculine cultures and might feel that it's very shrewd, it's very impersonal, that you spend your entire life working hard and not spending the time with your family or doing things that matter personally. Just the two differences between a masculine versus feminine culture in Hofstede's dimensions. The fifth dimension is on context. High context cultures is basically where the meaning is beyond what is said in communication. That based on the environment, based off of the relationship, that what somebody said isn't all that's being stated based off of their body language or their environment. Whereas in low context societies, what is said is exactly what is said. That whatever is highly articulated, communicated, typically in writing, is what is said. As you can see, the communication gap here. A high context society might shake your hand, and based on that handshake, you are in an agreement. Whereas in a low context society, that handshake does not mean you've agreed. The agreement takes place when we sign the written contract. It's explicitly stated what both sides will do. That's the low context. It's very direct and to the point. An example of a high context country is Saudi Arabia and even Japan. A low context culture is like Canada or the United States of America. A study was done on how high context versus low context societies tend to market themselves. And in the low context, or typically more Western countries, their marketing was more focused on profits, the awards that they've won, and how good their product is. Whereas in high context societies, typically more Eastern focused, the website had more information about their heritage, their national origin, or even some high-ranking officials that came by their business or are customers of them. Notice the low context was about, this is our profit, this is what we're great at, these are the awards. Pretty direct. Whereas in the high context cultures, it was about our history, who we are, the relationships we have with our customers and with very credible people. Thus, we can look at high context versus low context basically being the meaning is beyond what is said, or the meaning is exactly what is said, exactly what is stated. The last dimension that we are going to talk about is polychronic versus monochronic. Very simply, this entire dimension is about how different cultures perceive time. A polychronic culture views time and measures time through events, whereas monochronic cultures measure time by the clock. For example, if a meeting is supposed to start at 7 p.m., monochronic cultures will gavel down, meeting starts at 7. whereas polychronic cultures may start their 7 o'clock meeting at 7:07 or 7:15 because they're going to spend time talking, networking, socializing, grab a cup of coffee before we begin because it's more about the event as opposed to starting exactly at 7 o'clock. Some polychronic cultures are like Ecuador, Spain, Native America, Latin America, or Asian cultures, whereas monochronic cultures are like Japan, Germany, or the United States of America. An example of a polychronic culture is Ecuador, where back in the early 2000s, Lucio Gutierrez was the leader of the nation. And he discovered that because of the polychronic nature of their culture, they were losing $2.5 billion in business because their political leaders, their military leaders, and their top echelon of business people saw being late as a sign of status. And here's why. Being late meant you were a busy person. You were doing more. That I wasn't on time because I had other things I was doing, and I finally made the time to talk to you about this topic. Because this was an economic burden, Gutierrez decided to have a big announcement about how their culture and their country needed to be more prompt when dealing with other businesses. When his press secretary was supposed to make the announcement, his press secretary was late to deliver the announcement. Just speaking to the gravity of that culture and how polychronic nations and cultures tend to operate. Neither one is right or wrong, but merely they are different in how they perceive time. Even with their strategic planning, polychronic cultures tend to plan 50 years, 100 years in advance. It's typically very big picture because it's not so much about the clock as much as it is about the events they want to see happen over the next couple of decades. Monochronic cultures tend to measure their long-term goals in 1 year, in 5 years' time. It's typically not as far out because they're typically measured by the clock and these more short-term goals. In conclusion, Hofstede's dimensions of communication provide great insight and great awareness as to different ways different cultures might behave in regards to communication. Of course, everyone is unique and different as an individual, so they may not conform to every single stereotypical style of communication, as Hofstede mentioned. However, his dimensions do provide greater clarity on how typically that culture perceives that specific dimension, whether it was power, context, masculine, feminine, or what have you. One of the greatest tips of advice when working with intercultural communication or an intercultural leadership is always assume good intent, good intentions, right? We want to do the right thing, and the odds are the people we're working with, the people we're leading, also want to do the right thing. So those miscommunications that will occur, whether it's because of the specific words that are used, the different language gaps, or maybe it's just the way they perceive that specific dimension, communication miscues might happen. When I was in China providing leadership development training for Chinese students, there were numerous times where there were communication gaps. First one started off when I got off the plane. One of the first things the greeter said to me when I got off my flight and we were waiting for our cab was he looked at me and said, "You look a lot skinnier in your picture." And I'm thinking to myself, I just got off of a 23-hour flight, and he's saying I look skinnier in my picture? What is he implying? That I'm bigger than he expected? Later, I found out, and he actually brought it up again. He just said, "Oh, when I mentioned that earlier, what I meant by that was, you looked skinnier in your picture, and you looked more buff now." And he meant it as a compliment. And so we can realize that in that moment, just that language barrier, what he meant to say was a compliment. But I could have perceived that as a huge insult. And if I didn't just let it go and just allow it to happen, I could have made a fool of myself being offended by what was simply a miscommunication. Or also the way we look at a certain situation. Maybe some cultures perceive things more in a negative light, where others see it more as a positive thing and have a positive twist to the way they go about leading and working with others. But international leadership, that's sort of the final frontier, no matter where you are. And it creates such great opportunities, not only for your influence with others, but to be influenced by those other people. And it's probably one of the greatest experiences ever to be able to experience leadership among people from all over the world. And when we do that, we know that communication is the most fundamental way we interact with other people and get our message across. So being aware of the different dimensions, being aware that that communication barriers exist, can allow you to navigate international leadership much better.